It's an honor for me to preside over this part of our program on behalf of the President of the Summit, His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta, the President of the Republic of Kenya, who's unavoidably absent. So we can begin by moving on to agenda item number 6, which is about the presentation of the revived Georgetown Agreement. I'll now give the floor to the President of the ACP Council to present the revised Georgetown Agreement, hopefully for our endorsement. Any member state who's ready to sign this agreement, the Secretariat has the instruments of signature ready for anybody who's prepared to sign the agreement. I see. Apparently you're not hearing me properly. I'm sorry. Yeah. We are now dealing with item number 6, which is the presentation of the revised Georgetown Agreement. And I want to give the floor to the President of the ACP Council to present the agreement, the revised Georgetown Agreement, hopefully for our endorsement. And as I indicated, any member state who's ready to sign the agreement can find the instrument of signature ready for signature at the Secretariat. So, Mr. President of Council, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Excellency, the President of the Summit, President Kenyatta, Excellencies, Heads of States and Governments, the Secretary General of the ACP Group, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my utmost honor and pleasure to present to your high gathering the revised Georgetown Agreement for your endorsement. Mr. President, the Council of Ministers of the Group met a few days ago on the 7th of December to consider the revised Georgetown Agreement as recommended by the Committee of Ambassadors. ACP heads of states and governments will recall that at their successive summits, in particular at the 7th Summit in Sipopo, Equatorial Guinea, and the 8th Summit in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, they have reaffirmed their aspirations and political will by calling for a transformed ACP group of states into an international organization taking into account the changing global geopolitical context. In this spirit, Mr. President, the process to revise the Georgetown Agreement was initiated to reflect the aspirations of the highest authority of the group and their populations. It is clear that the ACP group aims to tackle the challenges to development in all its dimensions, including environment and climate change, peace and security, gender, private sector development, etc. In addition, ACP states recognize the international impact they could have as a group and as a major multilateral actor. ACP states have also made clear their desire to strengthen their cooperations, particularly in the economic field, in order to take full advantage of the global economy. By decision number 1/CIV/16, adopted on the 30th November 2016, at its 104th session, the ACP Council of Ministers made recommendations on the revision of the Georgetown Agreement with the objective of updating it and giving it a new vision in keeping with the aspirations expressed by ACP heads of state and government. By decision number 1/CV/17, adopted on the 4th of May 2017 at its 105th session, the Council of Ministers mandated the Committee of Ambassadors to undertake a revision of the Georgetown Agreement pursuant to Article 30 of the agreement and on the basis of the relevant decisions of the ACP Summits and the Council of Ministers, as well as the policy framework document towards the ACP we want, and to report to its thereon at its 106th session in December of 2017. Mr. President, by the decision number 1/CV111/18, adopted on the 14th of December 2018, at its 108th session, the Council of Ministers invited ACP member states and regions to submit to the Secretariat any amendments to the draft text of the revised agreement, which the Committee of Ambassadors had submitted to it for revision by the Editing Committee and presentation at the next session of the Council of Ministers. Consequently, Mr. President, on the 6th of July 2019, all ACP regions forwarded their comments on the Georgetown Agreement to the Secretariat, which were compiled and merged to the study it had commissioned in this regard to create a consolidated text of the revised Georgetown Agreement. By decision number 1/CIX/19, adopted on the 22nd of May 2019, at its 109th session, the Council of Ministers mandated the Committee of Ambassadors to finalize the revised Georgetown Agreement for submission to the next session of the Council of Ministers, taking into account the decisions reached by the ministers on the proposals, in accordance with Article 30, subsection 4 of the Georgetown Agreement. In keeping with this decision, Mr. President, the Ambassadorial Editing Committee took into account the following recommendations for the Council of Ministers. A, the effective rationalization of the ACP Group's core mandate, taking into consideration its human and financial resources in order to make it a more dynamic and effective organization. B, a future ACP Group that strives to achieve financial sustainability, firmly guided by the principles of solidarity and complementarity. The opening up of the Council sessions to ministers dealing with ACP-related issues and ministers of foreign affairs. D, the promotion of greater integration among ACP states. E, the taking into account of the dynamic global context with a view to developing an innovative and long-term vision. And F, the fulfillment of ACP Group's collective aspirations to become an influential player in the international scene. The Principles Amendment in the revised Cotonou Agreement. Mr. President, the most significant changes resulting from these various consultations are as follows. A, the structure of the revised text. The revised agreement now includes 13 chapters, 44 articles, and 2 annexes, while the current agreement contains 5 chapters and 32 articles. The preamble has been adjusted to reflect the spirit of the revised Georgetown Agreement. The name of the organization has been changed accordingly. This has resulted in a transition from the ACP Group of States to the Organization of ACP States. Each chapter contains a set of articles on a specific subject. The number of subjects covered has been expanded. Now global challenges and issues such as the environment and climate change, peace and security are being clearly addressed. The organization will have a dispute settlement mechanism. The appointment and dismissal of the Secretary General are now the preview of the Summit of Heads of States and Governments. Financial provisions include, among other things, the establishment of an endowment and trust fund and an audit and budget committee, and the Council of Ministers is primarily composed of ministers of foreign affairs from member states. B, legal aspects of the revision process for the Georgetown Agreement. During the discussions on the revision of the Georgetown Agreement, it became clear that the practices and legislation of the member states with regard to the adoption of the revised text differed, especially in terms of fundamental changes. Consequently, Article 30 of the current Georgetown Agreement, which provides for a revision procedure by simple decision of the Council of Ministers, is not adopted to take into account the internal constitutional requirements of each member state. In conclusion, Mr. President, I now have the honor to submit to you the revised Georgetown Agreement for your endorsement. In pursuant with Article 7, subsection 2 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Mr. President, upon your endorsement, the revised agreement will be open for signature by head of states and heads of governments or ministers of foreign affairs of the ACP states present at the 9th Summit. The Secretariat would facilitate the instrument of signature to each delegate. I thank you for your kind attention. Asante sana.
Thank you very much, the President of Council. The document that we have before us is one that has been worked on thoroughly at the level of the Committee of Ambassadors, at the ministers' level, at the Joint Council, and we now have the final document ahead of us. I would hope that if there are any interventions, they will be brief, because as far as I'm aware, all of us have had an opportunity to look at this document even before we arrived here today. So the floor is now open for any contributions. Right, the Prime Minister of Barbados.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Barbados, on behalf of the region, wants to support this revised Georgetown Agreement, and indeed, in so doing, I went back to the remarks of Sir Shudas Ramphal, who was at the center of that process. And I did so conscious that as we make the decisions for the revision of the Georgetown Agreement today, we do so aware that we need to be able to work together, as I indicated and yourself indicated yesterday, to be able to have a different focus that is not dependent purely on the value of commodities trade with a former colonial entity, but that in fact allows us to work cooperatively to meet the challenges of today. And those challenges go even beyond what we discussed yesterday with climate, with poverty reduction, with migration. They also go to matters that I know that are dear to your heart in respect to the reform of other institutions to which we belong. And I'm cognizant that the preamble and the early articles in this revision speak to the continuous adherence to the United Nations Charter. And to that extent, therefore, I want us to understand the fullness of our power and to recognize that we need to be able to work together also for the reform of the other international institutions to which we belong and which have not been as responsive to our needs for equity and for fairness and transparency in the conduct of the affairs thereto. So that, without being long, sir, I really do want to say that we think that this is a seminal moment. We are particularly pleased that in very many instances we are continuing the work of our founding fathers of an independent country, but we are doing so appropriate to the time in which we live and in a manner that will allow us, I believe, to have a greater degree of control over our destiny in circumstances where we now can settle the arrangements. I will only leave on this one point, sir. Yesterday I mentioned the issue of migration, and I do so again, because while it is not uppermost in the minds of those with whom we have trade discussions in a positive way, I believe that we will not see the full benefit of our potential for growth until we find the best way of managing our people and the opportunities for our people. I am aware that in your own circumstances, as with ours, that education is absolutely critical. And I'm aware of the discussion in Africa about the youth dividend. I believe that we need to settle on a minimum floor of rights below which no citizen should fall. And against that background, it allows for then the opportunities for managed migration to take place in the absence of the xenophobia that has attached this discussion to the movement of people across the world. So that I urge the Secretariat to develop a framework through which we can begin to settle how we see our own interpretation of this matter. I've contextualized at the Business Forum that in the particular issue of the Caribbean, we really, in fact, are facing a situation where we do not have enough people to do what has to be done to build out growth, but that there are other countries where there may be a surplus. And how we manage that relationship ought to be aided not just in the manner of our own particular national framework, but if we have a regional framework that buttresses our commitment on this issue of migration, then I believe that in the same way at the regional level, with the CARICOM single market and economy, with the African Free Trade Area, that we value the movement of capital, that we value the rights of establishment, we must now single out ourselves in this world by having a humane approach to the development and movement of our people for their fullest possibilities to be achieved. I'm obliged to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for those important comments. I think just clearly adherence to the UN Charter cannot preclude an agenda for reform of its institutions. So I think that we should be very clear about that. In acknowledging our respect for the Charter of the United Nations, that cannot preclude us from acting together to reform its institutions. I cannot see that can be banned. I think that the other comments about migration are absolutely on point. The Prime Minister of Jamaica.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, last evening, many heads endorsed the revised Georgetown Agreement during the general debate. Jamaica, and indeed the entire Caribbean region, is pleased to join them in their approval and endorsement and the transformation it anticipates. I wish to acknowledge the timely nature of the review process, which is at the foundation of a renewal of the organization, its partnership, and intended outreach to other countries. The opportunity is now being created for all the organs of the OACPS to rise to the challenge to operate at their full potential. The challenge now, colleagues, for all of us as ACP states, is never to be distracted from our fundamental objective of eradicating poverty in our countries, notwithstanding the many critical matters we have to address in collaboration with each other and our international partners. Implementation of Agenda 2030 is possible, and we can do it together. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. The delegation, the representative of Guyana, wants the floor.
Mr. President, heads of state and government, honorable ministers. Mr. President, thank you for allowing me to speak after two distinguished prime ministers of the Caribbean. But having the honor to represent Guyana, the birthplace of the ACP group, and having spent the greater part of my career dealing with matters ACP, I feel duty-bound to add my voice to those who have spoken to endorse the revisions of our charter. Mr. President, the revised Georgetown Agreement represents a recognition of the need to adapt to a vastly different environment from when the founders were inspired to establish our group. The revisions signal an acknowledgement that we need an organization of ACP states that is nimble, proactive, and ready to make its collective voice not only heard, but influential in the dialogues that will shape the multipolar world in which we exist. Acting together in an even more coordinated way will show that we are determined to remain true to the principles and objectives that brought us together 44 years ago. Mr. President, on behalf of the government and people of Guyana, I endorse the revision of the Georgetown Agreement and assure all that Georgetown will always remain the bedrock of the organization of ACP states. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention from Guyana. I think it's well accepted on all our parts that the foundation of which has brought us here was constructed in Guyana, and it will remain so. So your association and with this organization can never be eradicated. Thank you very much for that intervention. I believe that there are no other interventions that have been sought. So on that basis, we can take it that the summit has endorsed the revised agreement, and that therefore, what? I'm sorry. Apparently, my own nation wanted to say something. The delegation of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Ghana is mindful of the profound impact which the revised Georgetown Agreement will have on our collective development as a group, and certainly outstanding in what is now a high-stake geopolitical environment. Mr. President, with this revision, Ghana is confident that the ACP group is now poised to drive reforms at multilateral fora. Mr. President, we welcome some of the notable changes to the existing agreement, including Article 25 on the creation of subsidiary and consultative organs, such as the Interregional Organization Coordination Committee, the Business Forum to Private Sector Actors, and SIDS Forum, which is intended to address the specificities and needs of small island developing states. We are further delighted that the ACP group is embracing innovative financing arrangements with the establishment of an endowment and trust fund. Mr. President, I join previous speakers in congratulating the ACP Council of Ministers, both for carrying out the revision exercise with diligence and ensuring that the entire exercise was inclusive and consultative. It is worth placing on record, Mr. President, that the concerns of Ghana were taken on board in the revision process. In this regard, the delegation of Ghana will make the necessary steps to formally endorse the agreement. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Ghana, for that, and I think for those important comments and the contribution that has been made. So, as we can now take it that the agreement has found general acceptance and endorsement, and I want to commend the ministers and the council for the work that has been done in bringing us this far in the process of revision. Once again, let me indicate that any member state who's ready to sign this agreement, that the Secretariat is available to provide the instruments of signature for any member that wants to do so. So we have now come to the end of this session. We will take a break, and the president of the summit will then resume the chair for us to adopt the Nairobi Declaration. The Secretary General wants to say a few closing words.
Well, first of all, I wish to thank you very much, Mr. President, for chairing this session. I also want to be able to express our apologies to our President of Council, who, on account of his travel arrangements, will have to depart now. May I say on behalf of the Secretariat, we were particularly pleased by the level and quality of the engagement yesterday in the sessions dealing precisely with the background and the context and understanding the Georgetown Agreement and understanding the new vision and the new life that we want to put into the Georgetown Agreement. While as it is now a document, it will guide us in the programming and take into account issues raised, such as the question of migration and how we approach it, and also other aspects that are germane now to what we want to see in the new ACP going forward. I really appreciate very much the level and the contributions that our heads of state and government have provided to this summit so far. Thank you.